The changes in the education sector, the way we assess students, the rise of digitalization and artificial intelligence, the changes in the learning environment, and many other unusual and controversial questions. We will be examining them one after the other in this channel. My name is Daniel Wiśniewski, and this is Education Chapter. Welcome to Education Charter. My name is Daniel Wiśniewski, and I'm here with Jaco Deacon, who is the CEO of FEDSAS, which is a Federation of Public Schools from South Africa. Jaco, thank you very much for joining the Education Charter.
Yeah, thanks for having me today.
Jaco, I invited you here because I really wanted to speak about the South African system, and I wanted to speak about the South African education. But before we actually do that, I need to ask you a little bit about the context in which you operate. Because, I mean, for most of us, South Africa, when we think about South Africa, we think about two things: a world of division between one population or one part of population and the other part of population, and we think of Nelson Mandela. And this is the sort of two things that I think everybody knows. Some of us may even know about the World Cup that was there. It was the first African country that organized the Football World Cup. Or, so we think about Shakira singing and stuff like this. And those of us who would be interested in economics would think about gold mines and in fact, the richest country in Africa, which I think is something glorious to mention. But can I ask you a question about the transition, though? So we remember the times of apartheid, the times of the division. How did South Africa change since then? And what are the origins of the current educational system that can somehow originate from that political situation?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. And I think it's an important point to start, because this year we celebrate 30 years of democracy in our country. So 30 years ago, we had our first democratic election where all South Africans could vote in that election. He referred to Nelson Mandela. Now, there's his book, The Long Walk to Freedom. And in The Long Walk to Freedom, Nelson Mandela described that divide in our country that you referred to, which was called apartheid. It's an Afrikaans word. I'm from the Afrikaans community. So apartheid literally means to be apart. And the apartheid laws not only impacted on where you could work and whom you could marry and where you could stay, but also the kind of education you would receive in our country. And under a white regime, most of the money spent in education in the old apartheid days would go to white children in white education. And to be more specific, even more benefits for Afrikaans children in the white schools. Mm-hmm. The education in the townships was called Bantu education. And that was an inferior kind of education. Not sufficient money was allocated to the education. The teachers weren't trained to the same level. And obviously that was a breeding ground for resistance. And schools and educators played a very important role in the transition of our country moving towards democracy. And I think some of the photos that worldwide recognized as actually protests at schools that actually led to the fall of apartheid. But what happened in 1994 is we moved away from 17 different education departments in our country, and we moved to a system where we have a Single Schools Act making provision for public schools and independent schools. So those are the two types of schools we have in our country now. A public school. Some would refer to a public school as a state school. But in our country, we don't have state schools. The state will play a role in our public schools, but in essence, a public school will belong to that school community, and the state is a partner. And then the second model of schooling is the independent schools or the private school sector.
But just I will ask you, because I think, being European, I might not really truly understand this division. So you mentioned that there are the public schools, independent schools, which independent schools probably are the private ones.
The private schools, yes.
They are the private schools. Now, how about, so the public schools in the European sense, public schools are actually those that are fully funded by the government. And well, in some European countries, this would be managed by either local governments or ministries of education, or mostly these two institutions. How is it in South Africa? If you could simply tell me a bit of more.
Well, our schools, our public schools, we have 22,511 public schools. Now, every public school is a separate heuristic person, a separate legal entity. And that entity is governed by a school governing body. Now, the state is obviously an important role player as they provide the infrastructure, the buildings. Most of the educators would be appointed or will be paid by the state. So we don't rent the buildings. And the state is the owner of the land on which the school is situated, and they're the employer of the majority of educators. But this legal entity run through your governing body will take all the policy decisions. Obviously, the policy must be in line with our constitution, must be in line with our Schools Act and the regulations published by the National Department of Education. But I think part of the legacy of apartheid was to say we're never ever going to allow the state to have full control over every sphere of our lives. So White Paper 1, as the predecessor of our Schools Act, stated that the primary responsibility for the education of the children is the parents. And they've got an inalienable right to choose the form and the type of education they want. And the role of the state should be limited to make sure there's compliance. So the state should not control everything. We're going to take all the powers and put that in the hands of your school community, the governing body, to take responsibility for that schools. And I think that's one of the biggest differences what I've seen in Europe and how we do things in South Africa. So the ability for parents and the possibility for parental involvement is huge, as the ownership of that school is within that school community. But again, taking us back to apartheid, obviously in all communities, you don't have the ability to run a public school as it's supposed to run. And I think that's part of the legacy of apartheid, that 20% of our schools really perform on the level that they're supposed to perform. And 80% of our schools really struggle to get there. And with the incorporation of the Schools Act in South Africa, the idea was the moment we give responsibility to communities, that we would provide sufficient training and support to those communities to run the schools. And unfortunately, that didn't happen as it's supposed to happen. So if you look at our schools now, 20% of our schools are really performing on a top level that can compete with any international school, independent or state funded. But our 80% of schools that really struggle, that's the biggest challenge for our government, is that we spend close to 25% of our national budget on education, but still we don't see results or sufficient improvement in the 80% schools. And that, I think that's the biggest concern. And we're going to a national election later this year, and it will be a massive issue going into the election. What are you going to do to resolve the education crisis in 80% of our schools? So in a nutshell, that's the bigger picture. Now, we have a national education system, but we have 9 provinces. And every province will have a provincial department of education, and they're responsible for the to operationalize the education within the sector. So though we have a single Schools Act, it's actually managed in the 9 different provinces. And just to get back to that school governing body, next month, March, we're going to have every 3 years, we elect governors on the school governing body. So the parents will be the majority on the governing body. There will be educators, there will be non-educators, and in our high schools, there will be learners on the governing body as well. And obviously, your school principal is there in official capacity in any case. And they've got, in terms of the Schools Act, the responsibility to determine the mission statement of the school, the code of conduct for the learners, the admissions policy, language policy, policy on religion. They choose the kind of subjects that will be offered at the school. They're part of the appointment process, even for the educators appointed by the state. The governing body would make recommendations and rank them 1, 2, 3 for appointments. And even something like determining the school hours is done by your school governing body. So they've got extensive powers to deal with education matters in schools.
Mm-hmm. It's indeed, it's a very decentralized system, even for
very decentralized, indeed.
Even for a European eye, I would say. So having this in mind, so you say that your decentralization system actually originates from the times of apartheid. It was sort of a kind of a response to make sure that the state would not control education. But then you also say that many of them are not performing. What is the reason for it? What are the challenges that you see in the current system in South Africa?
Yeah, again, I think it's part of the apartheid legacy. And it's sad to say that 30 years down the line, government haven't sufficiently provided good infrastructure. In some of our rural areas, you still have mud structures for schools, where you don't have sufficient toilet facilities for our learners. We do have a sufficient number of educators. We've got more than 400,000 educators in the system, 405,000 educators catering for the 12.7 million learners. So I do believe that we have a sufficient number of educators, but our funding model is not sufficient to really change what happened 30 years ago. But there's also not a political will to get rid of the bad apples in the system. We are in education in our country is one of the highly unionized sectors. So 96% of all educators would belong to teacher unions. And again, the unions played a huge role to bring down apartheid. So they are very powerful within government. And the education union, SATU, is one of the biggest unions within the administration. So they have a huge say in the system. And I think that's also not helping to get rid of the bad apples in the system because of a strong union. Then our schools...
But that's a bold statement. So why is the involvement of the unions a bad thing? Because well, normally unions are kind of considered the defenders of the teachers. My personal view, probably, because I work with unions a lot, and I sort of often feel that they are kind of the power or the force that is trying to kind of petrify the system. But I don't know how is it really in Africa. So why is the involvement of the unions kind of having a negative impact there?
Yeah, well, I think the majority union is politicized.
Yes.
So they align to a political party and they run a political ideological campaign. We do have other teacher unions as well, which focus on the profession and focus on the development of curriculum and really professional. But I think part of that legacy is that union struggled to break away from the apartheid mentality of opposing everything instead of focusing on a professional development. And as long as we have a union that's aligned to a political party, you're in trouble. And I think that's the biggest difference between the unions you have in Europe and the union you have here is the political affiliation. And I don't think there should be a political connotation in the education sector where we're supposed to serve all the learners. The preamble of our constitution says we need to unlock the potential of every single person. And if you want to unlock, then you cannot drive a political agenda in a school. And I think that's part of our concern. So they protect the educators who don't perform. They protect the school principals who don't perform instead of really acting in the best interest of the learners. And that's my personal frustration with the biggest union in our country.
Well, I can tell you that in Europe, officially they are not politically related, but normally they are. So in many countries, they somehow have a certain political view on issues, even not particularly related to education itself. So I mean, I could give examples, but I think I would not like to spark too much of a discussion here about that. So maybe I won't. But in reality, they are all somehow, or many of them are indeed politically involved in one way or another. Now, many people would ask you a question about the divisions in South Africa. So you mentioned here that Since apartheid, lots of things have changed. That you have managed to build around 20% of all the schools that perform, and they could be they perform on a top level. They could actually compete with with I don't know, let's call it Western. I don't know if I could say that Western schools or the best schools in general. Um, but the question is, how is this uh, division has the division within South Africa been ended? Has there been progress? And of course I'm talking about either racial division or division related to status. Um, how is it? What's the situation over there?
I think the legacy of apartheid, specifically regarding spatial planning, your suburbs used to be black only and brown only and white only. And your schools were situated in those neighborhoods and suburbs. So to a huge degree, those schools are still situated in those old neighborhoods.
Mm-hmm.
Though you can stay in any neighborhood, the reality is that in some neighborhoods, you'll have more black children or more brown children or more Indian children or more white children than in other neighborhoods. But if you look at the admissions policy, any child can attend any school anywhere in our country. So that's guaranteed in the Constitution. So you've got a constitutional right to education, and you've got constitutional protection against unfair discrimination, whether it's on ethnicity, whether it's color, whether it's race, whether it's language. But in reality, we have 11 official languages, 12 if you consider sign language as well. So our schools would align to a specific language. So English would be the common language in most of our schools.
Mm-hmm.
But mother tongue education, there's a huge emphasis now in mother tongue education. So you can go to an Afrikaans school and English will be the second language, or is it Zulu school and English would be the second language? Is it Xhosa school and English as the second language? So that means that you'll have more isiXhosa and isiZulu speakers in that specific school than others. Even if you look at our member schools, it's unlikely that you'll find a school that's only white or only black, or more likely that you find only black because 90% of our learners in the system are black African, and the rest is split between your colored or the brown community, the white community, and the Indian community. But our member schools are really a very diverse grouping of educators and learners. So part and parcel of what we do in our schools is to manage diversity and to really celebrate diversity. So that's a reality. But I think we haven't crossed the bridge to say spatial differences is no longer a reality. It's still a reality in our country. But I think we no longer see that as a threat because children can cross borders. Your minibuses can move learners to different areas and different schools, and we see that. Parents vote with their feet.
Mm-hmm.
So if they pass 2 schools to get to the better school, they'll do that.
I will ask you even so to follow up this, because I think it's an important question. You know, I remember I studied in the United States in a southern state. I will not say where it was, but I did go to the so-called South. And one thing that did really hit me was I was in a city that was predominantly African American. And of course, well, it was like 66% of people living there were in fact African American. And yet I went to this university that was next to the city, and that was the best university in the town. And it was I think around 10% of African Americans were actually their students. How is the situation in Africa then? Is it, okay, you say in legal terms, there's no division there. You can go to any school. In practice, there's still spatial division, and it's sort of an aftermath of the times from long ago, and people still live in these neighborhoods. But in terms of educational attainment, do people of different colors, of different backgrounds, have similar, let's call it, opportunities, or do they prevail in the education system? Do they reach higher education and let's say, let's call it white collar professions? What's the reality there?
I think there's a good mix. We have a system that where we get state-funded bursaries to get to higher education. It's the beginning of the academic year for higher institutions as well. And the state offered 2 million bursaries to students to study. So there's a
And
commitment
you
from
have,
government to make it possible for our learners from the one system to move over to the next one. And that's not linked to any race.
and so 2 million students out of what, you said 7.2 million in total, is it? But you're talking about higher education students.
12.7 million learners in the system.
12.
But approximately 700,000 would complete their studies every year. So I would say good 20 to 25% would move into higher education or opportunities, and then vocational training and so forth. But unfortunately, our economy is not really keeping up. So the higher education system would deliver professional people with degrees, but they would struggle to get job opportunities.
Okay.
So the unemployment rate is extremely high in our country. You have professionals with medical degrees without employment. And I think that that's one of the serious issues that we need to address in this election. And all the different political parties, number one on the list is what are we going to do about unemployment? So although the system produces sufficient number of learners that will go to higher institution sectors or institutions, when they get out of the institutions, they struggle to get employment. But that's a political issue. It's not an educational issue.
Okay, but how is that possible that people with higher education, what's the percentage of population that has higher education degrees in South Africa?
I don't have the exact number with me now, but the last few years we managed to up it significantly by making the institutions, by offering more bursaries to our top matriculants to go into higher institutions. And obviously after COVID helped our system to develop, to absorb more learners through using technology and the COVID lessons to accommodate more learners or students at our higher institutions. So I think we're definitely on a trend where it's more accessible, and also government committed to really fund education on a very high level, not only for high school learners, but also now for our students. So they have to turn down students because we don't have enough spaces at our higher institutions for all the learners who want to go there. But I think the moment we start to unlock the potential in the economy and in the workplace, there's definitely sufficient number of young people that will be able to fill those positions.
And just to, if okay, let's say, does this then lead to a brain drain in
Yeah, for sure. Yeah,
so
we're leaking.
You're leaking graduates.
We're leaking graduates, we're leaking educators who are moving from Africa, applying for positions in Europe, and they get appointments all over Europe and in the East and in the Middle East. They use South African educators. Though we do have sufficient number of educators in our system, there's actually a surplus. So we're providing the rest of the world with educators, and we're losing skills. Okay,
so you have a surplus of educators, which in our European context is actually the opposite. What is the perception then? So just, okay, we have a framework now of how the system works, but coming to the teachers then, is being a teacher a respectable profession? Because you say you have a surplus, so you don't really have a challenge of that. So my first question is what's the status of teachers there? And the second question is, are they well prepared? Because you say, okay, 20% of schools deliver, 80, they could do better. So
yeah, for sure. Now, well, education is a career. So when you're appointed at a specific school, chances are there that you'll remain at that school for 30, 40 odd years. So it's not as if we can move people around in the system. I think that's maybe one of the shortfalls. In reality, if I look at our educators, there's still status attached to it. So it's a valued profession. I think it's declining like in the rest of the world as well. But I think in our deep rural areas, those are still considered literate people with knowledge that can unlock potential. So that's still there. And I think the reason why young people are still attracted to the profession is our salaries aren't bad if you compare it to the other job opportunities that's available. So all in all, if you consider the entry-level salary of an educator, it's substantially more than what you'll get in the private sector when you start your career. Obviously, there's a level where the private sector will pass, but for entry level, I think it's a very decent salary, even for our school principals, that we reward our leaders on the size of the school and years of service. So I think it still attracts people. The reason why we struggle to retain young people in the system is they look at the private sector, look at career opportunities in Europe and in the East and China, and they make money, and they're not. Hopefully, they will return. But for the quick money, they go abroad to make money, and hopefully they'll return. But the second factor is the environment in which teachers work is not always that conducive. The deep rural areas or disciplinary issues or the work environment. And I think that's our biggest challenge, to make the workplace not only safe, but it should be a place where I feel I'm valued. It should be a place where I'm not scared to be at the school and where I really feel I can make a difference. And there I blame the leadership in our schools. 80% of our school principals are not really helping to change the culture in our schools. If you look at the 20% schools who are really performing, number one, the biggest single factor that will determine whether you're a performing school or not is the principal of the school.
Right.
Everything stands and falls with quality leadership. So if you have a good principal, even in a poor community or in a difficult community, a good principal can turn a school around in a very short space of time. So if I were the minister, I would do more to invest in quality school principals to turn the system around than simply throwing more money at the problem.
And look, again, trying to kind of get a perspective, because it's clear that I think what I wanted to also hear here is about the perspective of a change. So since, if you could give me any number or a percentage, how did scholarization level improved in South Africa over the last 30 years?
Yeah, no, dramatically. I think in the first 5 years after the fall of apartheid, we had a massive intake of learners into the education system, where people really believe that education can change their lives. So if you look at Africa, the highest number of learners attending schools will be in South Africa. So it's a criminal offense if your child is of school-going age and he or she is not in school. So they can charge the parents. So the number of learners that enter the school system is extremely high. Part of it is in a huge number of our schools, you'll have a school feeding program, and some of the areas, that's the only meal the child will actually get. So they send children to school to get a decent meal. I think that's part of the retention of our learners. And then there's an exit point. At the end of grade 9, when you turn 15, you can exit the system, or when you write your senior exam, our grade 12. And there's still a huge dropout between our grade 9 exit level and our grade 12 exit level. And the reason for that is we only have an academic path in our system. In other words, we prepare the learners as if every learner would like to go to a university. And for the last 5 years, there's been a very lengthy discussion about a 3-stream model to really introduce your skill route for the learners and a pathway for technical and vocational training and so forth, and not only the academic one. And I think, and we used to have those many years ago, you used to have the vocational schools and the technical schools, but with the fall of apartheid, said, well, let's stop everything and let's just get an academic one. And now we're moving back. So we've been doing an injustice to a number of our learners by simply offering the academic career. So I think until we have proper technical and vocational pathways, you're going to see the dropout from grade 9 to grade 12, where learners are simply not interested in the academic side only. So if you look at the numbers intake-wise, I think it's extremely high. and then a dropout at grade 9, and then obviously a few learners that won't make it up till grade 12. But all in all, if I look at our matric results, that's our grade 12, the National Senior Certificate, the pass rate for last year is 83.8%, which is the highest in years. So there's definitely an upward trend in our matric results. Though the independent schools will have a 98% pass rate. So there's still a big discrepancy between your public education and your independent, although the independent system is very small. But learner retention and learners in the system, the highest in Africa.
And is it, so I can give you an example from Europe, like in the last economic crisis was 2008, 2010, which in my view, Europe has never really recovered. But in these times, what we did realize was that those countries that did have those systems of education that were not just focused on academic route, but also on other vocational route and technical route, did better. Because in fact, these two others, they foster employment. And I'm coming from Poland, and often I remember how many governments in my country were actually promoting the academic routes to such a degree that the vocational education was really declining. And if you would go to a vocational education, you would be considered, well, not only sort of inferior, really, intellectually inferior. So
exactly the same on this side, Daniel. Exactly the same.
So what happened was that when I graduated from university, which was slightly after the economic crisis, there was around 3 million Polish people that emigrated because they were having diplomas, university diplomas, or higher education institutions diplomas, and they didn't really have a job to do. So suddenly, especially after the EU accession from 2004 and 2007, we had 3 million people emigrating, doing dishwashing in London, Ireland, or somewhere in the West, with higher education diplomas. Now, you say you want to change that system in South Africa to make it more, to kind of foster employment. I think this is a very good path. What are the other achievements that you could name there? So scholarization is one, certainly. I mean, the level of scholarization. Any inspirational stories? Is there anything else that you guys did very well that people could learn from you?
Yeah, I think I would like to go back to Nelson Mandela, and he invested a lot of his time, even when he retired as president, in education. I mean, he got a very soft spot for education, so he would encourage learners our top learners who could become engineers and medical doctors, say, well, consider education first. We want the best young people to go back to our schools and teach the young ones, and go back to your own community where you came from and teach those learners to become the doctors and the engineers and the professionals. And he used to say that education is how we change the world, that through education, a child of a farm worker can become the head of a mine. A child of a domestic worker can become the president of the country, referring to himself as well. Now, if you look at our system, we've seen learners from deep rural areas, even areas without electricity, that were the top matriculant in mathematics for the last year in our national matric exam. The moment you have a good educator, and you can teach under a tree, if you're a good educator, you'll be able to unlock the potential. And we are seeing those learners who decided, I will go back to my roots, I'll go back to my village, and I'll be the math teacher there. We see the results now, and we see those young people entering universities, and they become the doctors and the engineers, and hopefully the president as well, making the difference. And a number of our schools really offer good extracurricular activities, sport, rugby and football and tennis. And you see those young people coming through the system and perform on international platforms, performing internationally, making a huge difference. Trevor Noah, the comedian, he grew up in a very poor area. And now Trevor is presenting worldwide, and he's got his roots in Africa. And I think that's why it's so comfortable to joke about diversity, because we have the advantage of growing up in a multicultural community and multilingual community to learn to work in different teams, in different cultures to the same objective. And I think that's maybe the wonder of what happened in our country 30 years ago. Instead of a civil war, we came together to say, but we can be a rainbow nation. And unfortunately, politics came in, but the potential is still in the country. And I believe that education is still the most powerful weapon that can change our country is through quality education. And that's why I work in education. I'm a lawyer. I'm not a teacher. And I do believe that that's the only way to change unemployment, to change the cycle of poverty is through good quality education, and then to make sure we create those opportunities that we don't lose the intellectual capacity that we've developed.
And despite all the differences and despite all the challenges that you may have faced there, you would consider this sort of a success, because you see, you mentioned also that many of the schools do not perform very well. And I don't know, probably I could imagine that South Africa, like many other African countries, is a country of many divisions, where especially social divisions, where is probably I don't know, I'm just speculating.
Yeah, for sure.
You
Yeah,
have
financially.
but there is a, there's probably, again, in my speculation, little middle class and the huge disparity between the higher classes and the lower classes. How is it there in Africa as well? If you could.
Yeah, it's still that's still the case. You'll see one of the biggest divisions in income is you'll have extremely rich people and then a huge poor community that's poor. So your middle class is actually getting smaller. Whilst you want your middle class to grow. And again, that's a political dilemma, and all the political parties are fighting to say, are we going to increase that middle ground? That's the people that would make pension contributions. That's the tax base. That's the people that will send the learners to become students. So that's a massive challenge in our country. And I think we need political will to really do that.
Yeah.
But Daniel, the nice thing is we don't have to start from scratch. We've got beautiful stories. That 20% schools is not situated at a specific place. Those 20% schools are situated all over our country, in rural areas, in cities, in urban areas, in even poor communities. So they are the beacons of hope, and they have the blueprint. So the neighboring school can actually just come over and say, okay, what are you guys doing? So the template for success is not outside our country, it's actually inside our country. And we need to be open-minded to say, okay, sometimes we need to say, we're going to dismiss you to get the young people in who are willing to sacrifice and do 1, 2, or 3, and that's political will. So I really hope that we get leaders, school governing body members, and political leaders that will have the best interest of our learners at heart when we go to elections. And then we can change the world. I'm convinced of that. Even as a white male in Africa, I can make a contribution.
And but again, nevertheless, is these 20% of top performing schools, do they also cross those divisions? Do they cross divisions between poor and rich, between white and black, and do they do that?
Yeah, in your top performing schools, you'll have a very diverse grouping of learners. And that's why I say we do have the blueprint.
Okay.
Intellectual capacity is not limited to brown children or Indian children or African children. It's our gifted children. So when we really unlock the potential of those learners, any good school in our country, you'll have a diverse group of learners in that school, but you'll have a leader that will celebrate diversity. That diversity is not a weapon. Diversity is actually a very valuable tool for the learners and for the teachers to use to develop those learners, not only to make them ready to get a degree, but to work and to operate in real life, because that's the world outside. It's very diverse in language, culture, religion, and if you get exposed to that on school level, that's a huge advantage.
The world is yours, isn't it?
Indeed, indeed.
I wanted to ask you one final question, really. I wanted maybe to open another line here before we finish. Well, South Africa is one of those countries that do participate in PISA and in the program of international student assessment, where well, the OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, is measuring the performance of students of 15 years old and or somewhere between the teenagers anyway, in basic skills, literacy and mathematics and science. How does South Africa do? Because South Africa does participate in that.
We take part in, and I must give credit to our Minister of Education. She's not afraid to enroll and to take part in international measurements. We don't always perform that well, but at least we know we've got a crisis. Before COVID, we had an upward trend, but after COVID, there's suddenly a downward trend in that result as well. But now we know there's a crisis and we can address it. And I think in our earlier discussion before the recording, I told you, the Minister of Education has been around for 15 years. One of the longest serving ministers of education, and to her credit, that she would open every single report. She would tell the public openly, we've got a huge crisis, but that's the action plan. So I do believe that there's a willingness to improve, but we're very concerned about the reading skills and the understanding of what our learners read. But part of the problem is that our learners would start in mother tongue for 2 or 3 years, and then they do a code switching over to English when they write those exams. For them, it's a language exam instead of a content exam. So there's a drive now to say, how are we going to improve mother tongue education, not only limit it to the first few grades, but let's take mother tongue education through up till grade 12. And I believe that's the vehicle that we need to use to unlock the potential of our learners, but also to make sure they understand subject content. That every test shouldn't be a language test for a learner. You should test the content of the subject. So there's movement in that direction. But if you look at the results, we're at the bottom of the list and we really want to move. And I believe we can, but at least we're not afraid to enroll and to look ourselves in the mirror to say we need to change something now.
And if you would, if you would have to think about the future of South Africa to improve education, what would be those things that if you would be the minister, let's say this lady who has been there for 15 years is going to retire and you're given a job, what would you be focusing on to change?
Daniel, 3 things. Number 1, I do believe in very strong leadership in education. That the McKinsey report said even a poor system can change in a very short period if you have good quality leaders in the system. Number 2 is get the best people to become your educators and retain them. So get our young people there, give them the tools they need to make a difference. And number 3 is to diversify our education system. We cannot stick to the academic pathway as the only pathway to our learners. So on vocational, technical, and really get industry involved, that we train the kids on the right skills on appropriate level, that they can become entrepreneurs, that they don't wait for somebody to employ them, but that they either employable or they start to employ because they can do it. And those would be the 3 things that I would do in the short term. But number 1 would be leadership. Get your leaders, empower them that they can get rid of the people who don't perform, but get the best people to become your leaders in our schools.
Thank you for that. Thank you for the inspiration. Thank you for telling us the story of education in a country of many divisions, coming from the past, overcoming these divisions over time, but yet still a country that is so diverse, so different, and has such a beautiful story all behind. Thanks a lot, Jaco, for your time. Just for our viewers, if you like what you see, please subscribe our channel, comment, and what do you think about, the South African system? Do you find it very different? To me, it's very inspirational that it's such a decentralized system that actually brings the education to the hands of communities and parents. It's very different, I think, than in Europe. And that's something that I find very positive. Tell us what you think about it, comment and share, so this video can actually reach a wider community. For now, stay in touch, and we see you in the next episode.